Hello there, listeners, and welcome back to yet another episode of Open Book, Open Mind. I'm your host, Edgar Chaput. Hosting duties have not changed, no plans for them to change. Open Book, Open Mind is the podcast where we discuss about, what else? Books. Mostly literature, sometimes history, philosophy, science, what have you. Coffee table books, we did one of those. Studies on reading, we did one of those. The point is, ladies and gentlemen, friends, is that we don't have to love the book, we just have to open it, read it, and keep it open mind. On this week's episode, on today's episode, we're going to switch it up yet again. I guess you could call this a spiritual sequel of sorts to one of the earlier episodes we released. I couldn't tell if it was episode 4, perhaps it was 5. It was the episode where I simply explained why I like to read, why reading is important to me, why I think it's such an interesting, fun, stimulating activity. Not necessarily for everyone, but certainly for me, and I elaborated on some of the most notable reasons why. Fairly personal episode, but I felt it was warranted, given that it was still early in the show's run, and I felt it was something that might be worth explaining. Like explain why one is attracted to any sort of hobby or activity. So this is kind of a spiritual sequel to that. I'm not going to rehash what was said in that early episode, but we're going to expand on it. And what I mean by that is I'm going to discuss briefly just a few books that left lasting impacts on me. The books I read in my life that have resulted in me being a relatively avid reader. Trust me, I know people personally who read 3 times, 4 times the books I do, but simultaneously, I think compared to the average human, I would be considered an avid reader. So we'll go with that moniker, at least for now. This isn't going to be an episode that's especially longer than any of the other ones. I know when I tend to discuss a book, I can take about 20, 25, 30 minutes to do it. It's not because I'm going to be talking about more than one book in this episode. This is going to be like a 3-hour long marathon. So, if the talking points are brisk, it's just because I want to emphasize some of the main reasons why I remember certain books so vividly, and how they shaped my interests in reading and my interest in reading in general. And in fact, in preparation for this episode, I actually took down some notes on a piece of paper. I usually come with a Word document with my notes, but I forgot to transcribe them. So if you hear shuffling paper, that's not intentional. I'm not trying to shuffle paper into the mic, but if you hear some of that background noise, it's because it just so happens that I forgot to transcribe my notes. So I'm doing it old school, very old school. These are going to be mostly in chronological order of when I read them, at least as best as I can tell. I'll put it that way. Book number 1 is The Murder of Roger Ackroyd by Agatha Christie, an English author, 20th century author, first half of the 20th century, and she was mostly known for her murder mystery novels. She had 2 recurring characters, a Miss Marple, who was, I believe, English. Now, I must confess, I have not read many Miss Marples in my lifetime. The ones I have read were those starring. Those were the central protagonist, the private eye, was Hercule Poirot, a little Belgian man who liked using his gray matter, that being the part of the brain, our cognitive skills, our reasoning skills, our intelligence. And The Murder of Roger Ackroyd is I believe it's one of the earlier Hercule Poirots, maybe not the first one necessarily, but it's one of the earlier ones, if I'm not mistaken. And I'm starting with this one because it's definitely the oldest of my reads. In other words, the one I did the longest ago. I was but a child, an innocent, naive child when I read this. Not like 6 or years old or anything like that, but I did read this when I was about maybe 10, 11, or 12, something like that. I've alluded a few times on this show that my grandmother, rest her soul, or may she rest in peace, had something of an influence on my interest in reading, and this is where that plays in. She was a big Agatha Christie fan, in addition to being an avid reader herself, and she didn't have all of them, but I remember her library in the back of her apartment, and there was a whole shelf just filled with Agatha Christie's. And this was the first one of those that I read. I've since read, Death on the Nile, Murder on the Orient Express, 10 Little Indians, I think it's called. But this was the first one, and so it got me into detective stories, which to this day I still enjoy very much, whether they're in literary form or film, streaming, what have you. I've always liked those stories, and The Murder of Roger Ackroyd is the starting point, the origin story, if you will, of my interest in detective stories. The idea of following these clues and trying to piece them together, which, is sometimes easier said than done, but if it's well written, then there are clues, breadcrumbs, if you will, dropped throughout the story. Now, I guess when you're a little bit more mature, you can start to reason with a little bit more facility than when you're maybe 10 or 11 years old and you've never really read any of these and you don't really have any experience with these types of stories. So to me, it was just, a rollicking good time following this snickery little, not snickery, but sort of bit of an outcast type of a character, because these stories happen mostly in England with English characters, and here's this little Belgian man with his Belgian accent, but he's always the smartest guy in the room, if you know what I mean. So I like the idea of following that character, him interrogating, questioning the suspects to the murder of Roger Ackroyd, the eponymous murder, and a very charismatic protagonist, memorable, not victims, but memorable suspects. And I think it was the structure of the murder mystery that grabbed my attention, and to this day has never really let go. And of course, if you've read the book, you know what I'm referring to. If you haven't, don't worry, I won't spoil it. But speaking of structure, there is something quite significant in the book that makes it playful. And not only was the experience of reading a murder mystery and following a detective was that new to me, and I fell in love with it, but the other thing was the storytelling device, this one notable storytelling device that's always stayed with me, and it's something that I've never come across again in another book I've read. Have other authors tried it, perhaps, and I just never got around to reading those books. I never stumbled into their path. But what Agatha Christie does in The Murder of Roger Ackroyd to really defy some expectations, I guess I'll put it that way, was absolutely mesmeric. So not only was the world of the murder mystery to me new, but so was the relative playfulness of the book's structure. The next book is Michael Crichton's Jurassic Park. Again, this is an extremely personal list, not only because they are books that I loved and to varying degrees still love to this day, but they're books, whether they are heralded as iconic classics that will stand the test of time, or they're just sort of just generally vaguely remembered, kind of like The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. If you're an Agatha Christie fan and a murder mystery fan, yeah, that's a great book. But if you're sort of more high-minded and you like high-minded literature, well, yeah, maybe The Murder of Roger Ackroyd is not going to be on your radar. Likewise with Jurassic Park. I don't know if it's considered fantastic literature, but it's certainly very imaginative and creative. And this is another one that I read a bit after Murder of Roger Ackroyd. Maybe I was in my very, very early teens, if at all. I might have also been 11 or 12, but I feel like it came just after Murder of Roger Ackroyd. And, this is, for someone who's only 11, 12, or 13, it is a fairly multi layered book. Speaking of things that were new to me, well, when it comes to Jurassic Park, it was this idea of the meshing, the marriage of a multitude of storytelling styles and genres, because it's a monster story. If we can consider the dinosaurs monsters of the ancient world, prehistoric monsters, at least as far as we humans are concerned, particularly when we rebirth them and they are part of our modern society, albeit on a secluded island, private island, but nevertheless, because we've never actually seen them before, and some of these are ginormous carnivorous beasts, well, they are monsters. They are the equivalent of the horror movie monsters, in this case, the horror literary monsters. And so there's that aspect of it, the thrill of these characters trying to, escape death, trying to cling to life through the jaws of death, the jaws of defeat. And at the same time, there are significant stretches of the book where the author goes into painstaking detail, not just about the park's structure and how it operates and how they try to keep the visitors safe, but also how they brought the dinosaurs back to life. Now, I haven't read this book since then, but at the time of this recording, there is a new Jurassic Park film that just came out. I haven't seen it. Frankly, I haven't seen the last few, but it did sort of inject me with a little punch of nostalgia. So I went out and bought a copy of the book, a little paperback copy, which I'm very happy to own, and I do plan on reading again quite soon to relive that experience. And it could be a completely different experience this time, but I remember being impressed, again, as an 11 or 12-year-old, but being impressed by how this book was giving me the thrills I sought after as someone who just, obviously loved the movie. The movie's awesome, Steven Spielberg's Jurassic Park, and being impressed by how I felt like I was reading something for adults. It was so complicated. The science behind the genetics of how they brought the dinosaurs back to life was it was so complicated that, I guess in an ironic sense, I felt comforted and that I was reading something for adults. This is a serious book. I mean, which it is. It's not really a kid's book. I mean, people get chopped to bits in the jaws of T-Rexes and velociraptors in this book. I don't think you would give this to a 6-year-old. But it was sophisticated insofar as I was seemingly getting an academic lecture on how you would bring dinosaurs back to life. Whether that would actually work or not is up for debate. If there is any such debate, I don't believe that would actually work. I don't think the science really works, but who knows? In 2025, apparently anything goes and anything is possible. Which, as certainly the film reminds us, sometimes we spend so much time asking ourselves and wondering if we don't stop to ask ourselves if we should. And therein lies the moral of the story of Jurassic Park. So a great bit of fun, if maybe not a Nobel Prize in Literature worthy publication. The next book is an Ian Fleming James Bond story, and funnily, so now we're advancing significantly in time. Like I'm not 11 or 12 or 13 anymore. Now I'm actually in my early 20s, and I'm not going to quote Casino Royale, although it's obviously a very important book in that series, and it's quite a good one. I'm not going to quote From Russia with Love, which a lot of people think is the best Fleming book. I'm actually going to quote the second one, Live and Let Die, which is not always cited as one of the great Ian Flemings. Not that people tend to poo-poo it, but it's rarely cited as one of the greats. If anything, people profess their love for Casino Royale, and then they skip over Live and Let Die, and then they profess their love and appreciation for Moonraker, which I also think is pretty good. But as far as what left an impact on me, you have to consider that I finally got around to reading the Flemings in my early 20s, and early-ish, mid-ish 20s. Yeah, no, early 20s. And I started with the Casino Royale and liked it. And again, to this day, I like Casino Royale, but it's a little bit terse. It's a little bit short. It's a little bit, I guess as subtle as a James Bond story can be, but it's a little bit more subtle. But I certainly enjoyed it enough to say, okay, let me see what happens in the next ones. And for as bizarre as Live and Let Die is at times, with, the villains work for a Soviet-backed espionage assassination branch who are backing African American wannabe pirates. It's a little bit strange. But there is something, speaking of pirates, there is something kind of swashbuckling about Live and Let Die. And I like the travelogue aspect of it, from Manhattan to Florida down to Jamaica and the Ile of Surprise. I really enjoyed the varying and disparate locations, even within the United States. It's a big country. Certain locations aren't quite like the other ones, such as South Florida and downtown Manhattan. It's not really the same place, even though you would be technically in the same country. And some of the parts and verbiage are antiquated. If you've read the book, you know what I'm talking about. If you haven't, I'm not at liberty to use some of the verbiage employed. Again, you got to consider that this is from the early 1950s, written by a sort of middle-aged British upper-class man with a particular world view, curious about the world. He was a journalist, after all. Curious about the world, fascinated about the world, enthralled by what he discovered throughout his global travels, but again, oftentimes written and communicated through the prism of someone from writing in the early 50s who is approaching middle age, and who was a bit of a snobby Brit. So yeah, some of the passages are a bit antiquated and a little bit eye-rolling, but I thought it was a lot more swashbuckling than Casino Royale. I felt the action was a lot better, and I felt as if I was reading something that was more akin to the James Bond movies I liked. And that was really the one. I don't know if Live and Let Die had been a lot like Casino Royale. I don't know to what extent I would be the Fleming fan I am today. I'm not suggesting that I wouldn't be. That's not what I'm saying. But the brisk, adventurous, action-packed tone of Live and Let Die was a great companion piece to Casino Royale, and I remember very, very much enjoying that one, and that one giving me the confidence to say, you know what, I think we're going to read all of these Fleming stories, which I have numerous times, and they're among my favorite books. And we're going to cap it off with, so as far as publication goes, we're going back in time, but it's the last one on this list because I read it a teeny weeny bit after Live and Let Die. So I'd be in my mid to late 20s, and it is Alexandre Dumas' Le Comte de Monte Cristo, the Count of Monte Cristo, which is, to this day, I think, if not certainly one of the greatest pieces of literature I've ever read. And again, even though I am the host of a podcast about books, some of you might be surprised to discover that there's a whole swath of literature that I've never even broached in my entire lifetime. I don't think I've read as many books as maybe some listeners think I have, since I'm doing a podcast about books. I actually haven't read as much as maybe you think. So when I say it's the greatest thing I've ever read, I don't know, I guess you could maybe take it with a grain of salt. But within that context, I do think it's one of the greatest things I've ever read, if not the greatest thing I've ever read in my entire life. Yes, there's some swashbuckling to it. It's extraordinarily intricate, and not just with respect to its plot points. After all, I have it in 2 volumes, each one of which is about 600 to 700 pages. So this is, the Count of Monte Cristo is, it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. But it's a marathon for excellent reasons. the reader needs to bask in its glory, if I can put it that way. It is a slow burn, and the journey of the character of Edmond Dantes, aka the Count of Monte Cristo, it is a worthwhile slow burn. By the time you get to page 1300, 1400, it's well worth it. There's romance, there's intrigue, there's a little bit of cloak and dagger involved, there's obviously some duplicity involved, and there's vengeance involved. And that last point is key. For as romantic as the book is, and as expansive as its storytelling is, and as rich as the tapestry of its characters is, and in each of those categories, the Count of Monte Cristo earns top marks as far as I'm concerned. At the very end of the story, obviously without giving anything away, but at the very end of the story, that notion of exacting revenge, the nature of revenge, what does it mean? What are you doing when you exact revenge? It is a form of playing God, because you are trying to do something, and probably not a very nice thing, it's called revenge after all, to another individual or group of individuals, or a state, or what have you, whatever the case might be. But you are exacting a negative energy and negative gestures onto something or someone else because you believe that it or they or he or she have wronged you. So in that sense, you are kind of playing God. And it's interesting because, again, I'm trying not to give away the ending, but there is sort of a character comes to term with the ideas of playing God and the risks to their own soul as to what that might mean. Because the Count of Monte Cristo, although he's really cool, he's really fashionable, he's very erudite, he's a very high society socialite, he's an intriguing personality, everybody's intrigued by the Count of Monte Cristo, but of course we know that the Count of Monte Cristo is Edmond Dantes, who was wronged at the start of the story and is now trying to exact revenge. And so it all comes together because the vengeance part is awesome. And then there's a question mark offered to the Count, to some characters the Count helped, and to the reader. So even the question about the nature of revenge is sort of tripartite. The Count is concerned, the people who he's helped are concerned, I suppose his victims are concerned as well, and the reader. Because the story is so awesome. And then we arrive at the end and it's like, well, what did the Count really do? And what does that mean about him, Edmond Dantes? It's fascinating stuff, and it's brilliantly written. Alexandre Dumas is one of my favorite authors. He's one of my favorite authors, and I'm going to be honest with you, I've only read The Count of Monte Cristo and The Three Musketeers. And just those two books alone, one of my favorite authors. Again, I've read far more Fleming than Alexandre Dumas, but I would still back Alexandre Dumas, even though I've only read 2 of his books. So there you have it. That was another episode of Open Book, Open Mind. I've been your host, Edgar Chaput. Hope you enjoyed this one. I had a lot of fun doing this one. Not so much research, just a little bit of nostalgia bait for myself, really, and going off the cuff, based off of memories and what some books that I've read recently. I actually reread The Count of Monte Cristo just a few years ago. I reread Live and Let Die just a few years ago. And memories that have stayed with me since childhood and early teenagehood. So this one was a lot of fun. I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll catch you again very shortly on the next one. Take care.